make everything work well, but also make it work well in a way that you can continuously improve and that you can lay a solid foundation for scaling later on.
Are staff changes threatening knowledge loss in your community, at your business? People leaving? Oh, hey, they stay there for a while and I'm going to go start my own thing or work for this other guy because I like his better or something. Or are you a franchisor looking to scale, need some processes, need to get things down? Well, my guest today has I'll consider it expert knowledge in that area. This is Stuart Nicholas, the founder of NIK Systems, N-I-K Systems. Welcome.
Hey, morning, Chris. Thanks. Great intro.
How are you?
Doing good, man. Doing good.
Before we go, where are you located? You're in upstate New York in some town I'd never heard of.
And that nobody's heard of, yes. I'm I think I'm probably about as far north of New York as you can go. I am 20 minutes away from the Canadian border. And, I'm an hour from Kingston because you have to drive around the lake.
Good. You were a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. I'm not quite sure what they do. Let's get into that for a second. What did you do there?
Sure. The Army has a bunch of different branches that do different things. The ones that are famous in the movies are like the infantry, but there's huge logistics areas to the Army. There's communications and things like that. So the Signal Corps basically does all things communications for the Army, everything from telecommunications to networking to any type of computer support to radio stuff. They do all of that.
Mm-hmm. And you did that for how long did you do that for?
About 10 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice there. Tell us about NIK Systems and what NIK Systems is and does.
Sure. What we provide as a service is process development. At its very core. So building processes for small businesses. I launched NIK Systems about 2 years ago. 10 years before, closer to 8 years before I launched NIK Systems, I worked in accreditation certification and got into doing some software development work. And during that time frame, what I had to pay a lot of attention to was business processes and how companies use them, especially accreditation and certification. Accreditation a lot of the time deals with how an organization actually operates and provides services and does all the stuff it has to do in the background. For example, the Better Business Bureau, right, accredits businesses for best practices in running businesses, right? So what accreditation often does, and plenty of industries are driven by accreditation and regulation nowadays, is it by the nature of things constrains how a business has to operate. The other thing that having solid processes does for people is it allows you to maintain quality of brand, right? Like how do you consistently produce your product and service in a high quality fashion, and how do you maintain those types of relationships outside the organization? How do you develop with consistency your reputation for doing that work, right? And so business processes play into all of that, and on top of that, they're the foundation for any technical solution you want to put in place. So if you're looking at telecommunication systems, if you're looking at networking, if you're looking at, moving something to the cloud, some type of cloud solution that's going to allow your business to operate, your business process is the foundation for how that works. It's also what guides your team through how you do your day-to-day work, right? And so what I did coming out of the Army, like you said, like you were mentioning, I did 10 years in the Army. I was huge into team building there, mentoring people. Also, people don't think about it very often, but continuous improvement and developing standard operating procedures. It's an ongoing basis in the Army. So building off of those two things, when I came into the private sector, I started looking at small business and the way that they operated and the experience that I gained there. And when I did, I noticed that there were three layers of small business that I thought could really use some help in the process area. So I started looking at independent operators, right, sole props that are out there. I started looking at startups, and I started looking at kind of established small businesses, stuff that's been around for 10, 20, 25 years, and thinking about how business processes can best serve them. And so what I discovered was, if you're a startup and you're operating, that 3 to 5 year type of range, and you're still kind of not flying sloppy, but you don't quite have that path all the way laid out, but you're doing great work, right? If you're doing that,
sure,
it kind of looks like that from the outside, but maybe your internal staff are kind of They're trying to figure out the best ways to work together. You guys are wearing multiple hats. They're really struggling to get where they're going, even if they do look fantastic from the outside. So one of the things that you can do in order to make that business better, and especially if you're wanting to scale later, is starting to formalize those processes. Because if you do that, you start to formalize what type of talent you need in-house and how that talent works together to try to do whatever it is that you do, right? If you're inside of a small business that's been around for a while, what happens over time, and this is true for any organization, it doesn't matter if you're in the government, it doesn't matter if you're in the private sector, if you're producing a product, or if you're in a nonprofit, what tends to happen when an organization starts then lifts off is over time, like a lot of the time you'll start off as a sole proprietor or something like that, right? Over time, that guy that was an expert on that, as the company grows more distant from the work. And so what you end up with is you end up with a team that's on the ground doing the work, where the guy that owns the company is at the top, and then you have some mid-management in between, right? But the thing that happens is you get disjointed, right? You don't have that same type of clear sight into how your organization operates, and you've over time, developed very good ways of operating. Some good, some not so good, right? But in the business of running day-to-day operations and trying to grow your business and do well, oftentimes it becomes very, very hard to slow down and be able to actually document the knowledge that you've gained about how your business operates and what you need to do. And so for a small business like that that's a little bit more established, maybe you haven't jumped into a huge technical solution yet, you haven't invested the $1 million in technology. If you're that guy or girl, what I'll do in that situation is help you document those processes. Also, and poke holes in the stuff that you're doing, and force you to question the way that you've been operating. Because oftentimes, if you've been operating for a long period of time, people don't. A lot of the times, it's just the nature of human beings. They don't like to challenge the way that they're operating on a day-to-day basis. They don't like to visit they don't like to visit the hard spaces. And so one of the things that I do is I tell people, I'm like, a lot of the time people have a love-hate relationship with me, right? They love the fact that I'm doing this work with them, and they like the fact that I'm collaborating with their team, and I'm serving as a good guide, but I'm also challenging their mind in ways that maybe they haven't challenged it yet. And so...
Right. Get some pushback on occasion, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. And then if you're an independent operator, right, somebody who's just diving in, maybe you want to grow, maybe you don't want to grow, but maybe you got aspirations that one day you'll scale. If that's the case, one of the areas that sole proprietors and new business owners face is that they don't start documenting early into the process, right? And you're trying to wear 75 hats in order to have your business rolling. And the problem is that it becomes very, very hard to see these things and make everything work well, but also make it work well in a way that you can continuously improve and that you can lay a solid foundation for scaling later on. Whether or not you want to do that right now, there's a good possibility you'll want to in the future. And so it's smart to sit down and try to get that stuff nailed down as you go, rather than 15 years down the road, try to go backwards and get everything and try to get everything out there.
Yeah, start it. But you must come into the occasional business that, has been around a while, but doesn't really have a mission. Or a process in place, but and they're making money and they're going along and they're doing their thing, and everybody's happy. At least they seem happy from the outside, but maybe they're not. And it must be, if they're calling you to come in and help, they must sense that something is going on, something is wrong somewhere. If a company does that, and you're one of and you have that unique skill set to be able to basically walk down the aisle and say you could do this differently, and what's your company mission? Do people follow that, or do they know what's really going on? A lot of that, I'm sure, happens.
Yeah, definitely. Most commonly, when it comes down to a business that has been around for a while, it comes down to a question like that, right? Like they're aware that they're running into some problems some places. They don't necessarily know where. Right, and also you're playing the blame game, right? Like if you get onto, if you're operating in a small business and you got anywhere past 3 people, two people you have to collaborate, but past 3 into the 5 realm and 10 realm, you definitely have to collaborate in order to get stuff done.
Sure.
It's another part of human nature to to look at issues and pretend that the other person is doing something bad or malicious, or they're skipping this, or they're not doing whatever, because the reality is that, like I said, building off a foundation of what I learned in the Army, right? I had a gentleman who I worked for who was one of the, in the Army they're called non-commissioned officers, right? Sergeants. He was kind of the top dog in the company that I was with. And he used to say this. He used to say there was 3 reasons why why people don't do something, right? You can't do it, you won't do it, or you don't do it. Those are the 3 reasons.
Yeah.
Right? And if you can't do something, that's a matter of resources. Right? If you don't do something, that's a matter of training. And if you won't do something, that's a matter of heart. Right? So resources you can fix by either throwing money at it or more time, right? Maybe more people. If you don't do something, that's a matter of training. If it's a matter of heart, then you can't fix heart. Most people, just as a sense of human nature, want to jump to the point where they look at something and they go, this person isn't doing this because they don't want to do it, or they're trying to make my life harder, or they're ignoring this thing that's making my life more difficult. Right? The reality of the fact of the matter is nobody wakes up in the morning going, how can I do a bad job today?
No.
I mean,
no, it's just, yeah.
Even a
They don't always. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, even a crook wakes up and goes, how can I not get caught today?
Yes, I know.
So.
Which happened recently in Glens Falls at a bank. I don't know if you heard about that.
Oh, I didn't. I'd like to hear it though.
Bank robbery down here in Glens Falls. As of this recording, he's still at large.
Oh.
At this point in time. But that's another whole thing. I'm sorry I got onto that. One of the things you do is something, and it's on your LinkedIn profile, and it sounds you've been describing some of it already. It's called business function decomposition.
Right.
And what is that exactly? I have an idea, but what is it?
Business function decomposition is a long phrase with a lot of geeky terms in it. That's what business function decomposition is. See, and I can say that, right, because I am a geek.
Yeah, right.
So business function decomposition, sometimes if you're into businessy stuff, you've heard the term function, but the easiest way to translate that to maybe a layman is it's a department, right? A lot of the time it translates for a business person into being a department, accounting, whatever, right? So what a function is from a process perspective is it's a grouping of processes that's designed to produce an output of some sort, and these processes work together to do it. So one of them that I commonly end up working in, and this was actually a shock as I started Nix Systems and have continued to grow it over the last couple of years, was marketing and sales tends to be a key function of a lot of businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So underneath marketing and sales, you might have, one of your specialties, right? Social media marketing. If you're doing that, one of the processes under that might be content generation, maybe.
Yeah.
So content generation might be under there. Also managing whatever social media campaign that is, managing an email campaign. How do you go about doing these things? Now, the objective of marketing and sales is to eventually lead to a sale, right? Delivery and other stuff like that. But you can start to see where that business function might be there. The way that works in a business a lot of the time is that, especially if we start playing in that startup or small business realm where your team is working together and you're wearing multiple hats, maybe you haven't given a lot of thought to how that's actually structured. Is there a structure there? Is there a structure there, and how does it operate? Because one of the key things that I play with in the process realm is I look at something and I go, what's the business function? What are the processes under that business function? But outside of that also, who is the process owner who has the ability to make decisions about what that process is, how it operates, but also who's the primary actor? Who's the person that's on the ground doing the work? Right? Because it informs it informs the structure of that process and how that process actually operates. Decomposition allows you to see that top down. If you're at the top of the organization, say the CEO, the CTO, the VP of marketing and sales, it allows you to look down through the organization and see the groupings of processes that form one of those departments and how they actually operate, but also the people that are responsible for making it happen.
Okay. One of the things that makes a lot of sense. It makes perfect sense. One of the things you write on your LinkedIn profile, something called process mapping. Well, on the surface, I think I know what that is, but it says you develop an intuitive, that's the word, intuitive map using swim lanes. What's a swim lane? I wanted to ask you that. Ever since I saw that phrase, I wanted to ask you that.
Swim lane is an appropriated term, I think, from
Okay.
from athletics to geekdom, right? If
Yeah,
if
it
if,
is.
if you're looking at that stuff from a business analysis perspective and things like that, if you take a swimming pool, you lay the swimming pool out and you look at it from top down and you see it with the ropes. We just saw recent articles in the news about that, right? Swimming competitions. You see each person swimming has an individual lane across that pool, right? If you're looking at
Mhm.
a cross-functional process diagram, or a process map does the same thing, except what it's allowing you to see is it's allowing you to see either an entity or the individual. I want to say person here, but I tend to play more in roles. But it's the person who's fulfilling the role within the organization. So what you can see is you can see from the start of a process, what triggers that process to what the intended end state of that process is. You can follow that down through each one of the individual sub processes that have to take place and identify what it is that your team is doing all the way through in order to accomplish whatever a process is designed to do. In the case of a sale, get it to a point where sales eventually has the lead, they present the opportunity, they make it through there, they make the sale, and then you start handing off to delivery, right? And once you get handed off from
Mhm.
delivery to accounting, so on and so forth. But those are all different processes, and so the process map allows you to see that clearly. What are these
Mhm.
individual steps?
I got you. I got you. It makes sense. You do have something else here called workflow diagramming. Now, on the surface, that phrase sounds, self-explanatory, but basically, you produce an easy-to-read diagram that helps the business owner, I guess, or the one that hired you, I guess, understand the work that their team is doing, every task, and how it fits into the process management. Is that an accurate assessment there?
Yeah. It's if I'm looking at this stuff and I'm talking about it, I've heard actually other people in other process spaces say the same thing along the same lines of thought here, but I tend to look
Hmm.
at processes in terms of like a layer of abstraction or layers of an onion, right? So in order to
Hmm.
get to a real understanding of how a business is operating, what you want to do is you want to peel off layers of that onion into more detail. And so the way that I separate a process map from a workflow diagram is that workflow diagram gets into actually how the team is doing a piece of work, a sub process. It takes a sub process and breaks that down into further detail. So, for example, if you were going to manage an email campaign, right?
Hmm.
If you're going to do that, there's a couple of different approaches you could do. One of them is maybe you got some internal person handling that social media campaign. Maybe marketing's handling it directly, right? So if it's not that, if you got some type of account manager or salesperson who's running that social media campaign, maybe that first step involves maybe it involves going to someplace on somebody's server in order to get the in order to get the content that you're going to post, because marketing maybe has
Okay.
already done that job. And so they'd get
Hmm.
that. So they'd get that information. They'd schedule the post. The post would go up onto whatever platform they were using. LinkedIn is one of me and yours favorites. So you do that. You go back and you check for engagement on it, whatever. So you work through that, and you can see the difference between saying that you're running the social media campaign or managing the social media campaign versus at the process level, it's something different.
Wow. Wow. Don't you love that? That's a soundbite, Stuart. I call that a soundbite because that was pretty good. I like that. And here's something that's on your LinkedIn as well, because it's so well done on your LinkedIn profile. So I have to, and you should go check this guy out, Stuart Nicholas on LinkedIn. Task-based procedural documentation. I think you've touched on a little bit of that already. You create comprehensive, perhaps new procedures or different procedures that describe how each task that's needed to be completed in the company is actually completed. Is that kind of the way that is?
Yeah. Matter of fact, it might be a good point to dig into a little bit about how I felt like my military experience rolled into some of the later experience and kind of spilled stuff together here. Because
Sure.
if I look at stuff, there's I guess I look at things. Peak performance is what I say that I help people achieve, and people look at that stuff from different perspectives. I know some people focus on process improvement and continuous improvement and things like that. I look at that in terms
Right.
of if you want to reach peak performance, you have to consider yourself with competency, clarity, readiness, and discipline. Right? That's how you achieve peak
Mhm.
performance. How you really achieve it. And so, coming out of I didn't know this until some time after I left the military, right? I realized this after the fact, which was beneficial to me because it brought me to going to school, but left me kind of flat-footed
Right.
a bit when I first transitioned. And so what I noticed after I got out was that the military does a great job of training you for a specific job. They want you
Mhm.
to do this job. They want you to do it excellently. They want you to be an expert in what you're doing on a daily basis every time you do it. They want it to become a natural part of who you are. And so they train you that, and you
Right.
get really, really good at that. You know, uh, for me, when I first went into the Army, my job is I started off as a telecommunications technician. The very first thing that I did when I hit my first unit, went on my first field exercise, was pounding a 6-foot steel ground rod.
Oh.
Because I worked outside of a communications van, and every time you did that, right? So you start at that base level and got really, really good at what you did. Um, I had an instructor who was before I got to my first unit who said the difference between an operator and a technician is an operator knows how to make something work. A technician knows how it works.
Yeah.
And so,
That's a nice distinction. Yeah, I love that distinction.
yeah, and so what I noticed coming out of the military and looking back on that time period is that what companies do a lot of the time in the private sector is they hire for general competency, which
Mhm.
is why a lot of time you see them focusing on, I want a 2-year degree here, I want a 4-year degree here, I want maybe a master's degree here. But when they do the hiring process, they aren't. It is sometimes very, very hard to find somebody, especially at the entry level, right? Because it doesn't exist, but a more seasoned person who has a lot of exposure to the industry and type of work specifically that they do. And so what the business does is they hire this person for general competency, hoping that they have the ability to do something.
Mhm.
Right. And so
Got it.
and so often they'll talk about how do you develop this person so that they can, they'll go through an onboarding process that kind of maybe you walk around and you do a couple lunches with people in house and they'll show you the server system and they'll say this is the email system that I use or whatever it is. Here's your desk. Here's where you get a water if you're thirsty during the day. But it's still a general
Mhm.
competency, right? This person doesn't necessarily know the business environment and they're looking at stuff like how in 90 days how can you make an impact,
Yeah.
right? Because they're evaluating whether or not this person with general competence can make an impact in the organization. The military doesn't do that. The military goes the other way around. The military starts with somebody who's fresh out of high school, maybe hasn't graduated high school, has a GED, and they say, how can I take this person who's reasonably intelligent, we can tell because they took an ASVAB, so we checked them for general ability to understand information, right, and think. How can I take this
Mhm.
person with no background, no expertise, and no skills and build them into this highly proficient professional? How can I do that?
Yeah.
So what I saw when I got into looking at small businesses was the opposite. Like I said, they hire for general competency, and then they focus
Mhm.
on what's the impact that you can make here. Well, task-based procedural documentation. If you're going to onboard somebody, if you're going to make somebody proficient within your business environment, what you want to do is you want to be able to identify the key task that you have to do in order to make your business run every day successfully.
Right.
So if you're going to onboard somebody who's going to
Okay.
be proficient in what they do, you want to be able to identify what those tasks are, spell it out in detail, and train that person on how to do it. So the focus during that 90 days, if you have something like that in place, can instead be getting that person up to par so that they can actually do that.
Got it.
And that's where the knowledge retention comes into play, right? It's because if you have that stuff documented, in the military we call it a mission essential task list, right? Take a look at the mission that your organization does, identify the key task, get that stuff nailed down, and train on it however you need to do it. This is how you operate during peacetime. In wartime, you operate in real time. You put that task into play, you check that procedure, you have them do the procedure, in real life operations, and then you go back and evaluate whether or not that procedure worked out the way you thought it should, and if it didn't, you improve it.
I'm just going to say, Stuart, that what you're talking about today is down deep into the weeds of processes and ways to make businesses more efficient. And the fact that you've tied your military training into your current business is just nothing short of awesome, I think. And if someone wants to contact you, I mean, they can get you on LinkedIn, of course. But what is the initial conversation like? If someone decides, hey, we need to fix some stuff, so Stuart looks like the guy that can help us, or sounds like the guy. What's that first conversation like with somebody that wants to on board with you?
Well, I think a lot of people are surprised when they deal with me. First of all,
How so?
as we've already discussed here, I came from a deep background in public service. After that, I got into nonprofit work. The side of Nick Systems that we didn't talk about is that it's very community facing, right? Like I'm involved with the church. I'm involved with Team RWB, which is one of the best veteran organizations in the country. So I'm involved with the land trust locally. I'm very, very people first is how I like to approach business. And the thing about it is that I don't want to walk into a business relationship with somebody I don't feel like I can serve or I don't feel like I can work with, and I hope that they're the same way on the other side. And so a lot of the time walking into a first conversation like that is exactly that. For me it's an interview with the person to see, to check for compatibility, to really talk about, what are the challenges that they see? How do they approach work? Do they really understand their environment? Do I understand their environment? And so a lot of the time the discussions that I have start at that kind of relational level and work out from there. And so if you look at my website, and it's also mentioned on my LinkedIn profile, but I consider myself offering two basic services, and one of them blows the mind of most consultants that work in this space, any space within consultant work, is that I say that I offer a free initial consult as a service. Now, if you walk into a discussion with most people that work in management consulting, what you'll get or a lawyer or anybody else, what you'll get is you'll walk into a 15-minute dialogue with this person, they'll give you a solution, and they'll try to pay, and they'll try to sell you on it, right? I don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to be successful at what I do. I want to provide immediate value to you, and I hope that the person is looking at it in the same way that I am. And so I guess a caveat to that is I don't like presentations. I guess I have an old school look on business and work that says the work that I do for you ought to stand for itself, right? So like one of the things I've said in the past is that trust the guy that's willing to do the work. Don't trust the promise.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So the quickest way that I can think of to do that is, and this goes back to my software development background a little bit, I guess, in the agile world, is what I try to offer new clients up front when it makes sense is I try to give them 15 hours of time free up front. And what I try to do is I try to take a look at their problem, take a look at what they're communicating to me, figure out something that I can tangibly put in their hand at the end of 15 hours so that they can immediately start to gain some clarity about what it is that their organization is doing and how they might want to proceed. So a lot of the time coming out of that 15 hours of work is, that functional decomposition diagram that we talked about at the beginning, a lot of the time that's at some initial version of that is a lot of the time what they end up looking at.
Okay. Wow.
And then after that,
Stuart, we could talk on
yeah,
we could talk on this for forever. I think we're gonna wrap this session up. We're gonna have you on again, I think, if you'd like to come on again, and get into some more, maybe down into the weeds on specific procedural things that you've done for specific companies.
Sure.
Today was kind of an overall get to know you sort of a podcast, I guess. I want to ask you a couple of questions, and I'm not sure I prepped you for this.
Well,
But what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite movie of all time?
What is my favorite movie? My kids would probably swear that it's any of the Star Wars movies.
Okay.
I don't think so though. I think probably if I had to look at that, I'd have to look at what movie if I'm flipping through the channels. They don't even use channels anymore, do they? If
Well, no.
if I'm going through Netflix, right? I guess
Netflix.
what movie would I watch if it came up? Probably every time, and probably Good Will Hunting.
Okay. I don't know that one, but who's in that one?
Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Robin
Okay.
Williams.
Oh, okay. Maybe I've seen it and just forgot the name. That's cool. So if you here's another question. If you had a time machine, you could go back in time and talk to a mentor, somebody who you respected and looked up to from the past, who's not alive anymore. Who might you want to go back and speak with? Doesn't have to be somebody famous.
Oh, this guy's not famous outside of circles that don't care. Probably a gentleman named John D. Morton. John Morton was one of my earlier platoon sergeants while I was in the Army, and it's not a very happy story because John was killed a few years ago in Afghanistan.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, which is
Wow.
why the time machine comes into play, right? The thing is that I knew John when I was much younger in my life, and John, at the time that John passed, he had a beautiful family, and you don't see families all the time when you're in the Army, but I believe he had 3 kids. I remember his wife, all fantastic. And the thing about John is that John was probably, looking back on it, one of the best men that I've ever met in my life. In the Army, he was kind of outside the, I guess, the stereotype that you might typically see. He was a very sensitive individual, very invested in his people, very patient with his people. And I met him when I was in my early 20s. And at the time, now I'm 44, right? I've had a couple decades of time to mature and grow in ways that he probably would have been much more pleased with. But at the time, he really invested in me in ways that sometimes, especially in that environment, they don't necessarily do. And it would be, I think if I had the opportunity, I'd go back and I'd probably take the time to learn a lot more from him.
Okay. That's awesome. I love hearing stories like that. And I'm sorry for your loss. Afghanistan was a tough place, I'm sure. And you know about that more than I do. Stuart Nicholas from Nick Systems. Get him on LinkedIn. We'll have the website on the screen throughout the entire interview. And thank you so much for your time today, Stuart. It's been very enlightening. And I know my friend Josh Rockwell is going to want to listen to it.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a real pleasure.
I like to do this. Now, this is not Star Wars, it's Star Trek, but live long and prosper. and by the way, my favorite Star Wars scene, and I wish they could have done it differently, but they had to catch up because of the prequel thing, was the whole Mace Windu Darth Sidious battle in Revenge of the Sith.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Nicely done.
And then, I think Anakin just screwed up there. But I didn't like seeing Samuel L. Jackson flying out a window or whatever. I just wasn't cool.
No.
Anyway, thanks a lot, Stuart. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Chris. Pleasure.